Uploading.
You were trying to defend the military occupation of their world. How grateful did you think they would be?
My understanding of this conference was that it was supposed to be an examination of the occupation from a dispassionate historical perspective.
Before we delve too deeply into this controversial essay, there is a social theory that we're going to be relying on to analyze the brutal occupation of Bajor. That's specifically to speak of institutionalized racism. Institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, is a form of bigotry that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or an organization. With that in mind, we have to understand that it is possible to exist in a system, even feed that system, and not actually have the traits of the system. So, and here's the hot take that's going to make some people mad, it's possible to live within a society that is highly racist, and not be racist yourself, but still help to encourage that racism. To be clear, I'm not here to debate if this is true or not. It is the context in which I'm discussing the topic. It'll give a frame of reference to the discussion that's about to occur, and is probably why half of you have already clicked off. Let's just get into it.
What did peace and spirituality get us? People starved by the millions. Bodies went unburied. Disease was rampant. Suffering was unimaginable.
To understand the Bajoran Occupation, let's analyze the Cardassians a moment. Originally, the Cardassian people were supposedly very spiritual and possibly very peaceful. Cardassian society highly valued family and loyalty. While the Cardassians seemed to always have a hierarchical culture, indeed that went from the family to the state, both men and women shared responsibilities, and there didn't appear to be any major form of misogyny nor misandry, at least within the society itself. That said, even though there was no obvious sexism, women and men often gravitated towards one profession over the other. Women would lean towards the sciences, and men leaned towards government and military jobs. It didn't mean that there was an overlap, that it never occurred, it's just what the sexes naturally wanted to go towards. The Cardassian people were extremely meticulous in everything they did, from religion to record keeping. But with all of these attributes, Cardassians also appeared to be pretty pragmatic. They are willing to make tough decisions, even if the decisions seem callous. They wanted to do what was best for all. So, taking all of this information in, a picture is slowly being painted of a people that are passionate, are meticulous, and prone to making decisions that they believe helps the whole body, possibly at the expense of the few.
I know that once you were a peaceful people, with a rich spiritual life.
Looking at all of this, there is nothing inherent in Cardassia's past to show them to be bigoted or self-absorbed, which makes the occupation all the more tragic, and all the more realistic. Let's analyze the Cardassian people a little further. The ruinous history of Cardassia is heartbreaking. While the religious aspects of the Cardassians inspired great arts, great literature, and more, it didn't do much to feed the people. If we believe what we are told by various Cardassians, all of Cardassia was largely starving. There were children on the streets, crime was rampant, and no one seemed to be able to fix it. It was chaos, or at least it felt like chaos.
But we are feeding the people. We acquired territory during the wars. We developed new resources. We initiated a rebuilding program. We have mandated agricultural programs. That is what the military has done for Cardassia.
Due to this misery, authoritarian elements, mainly the military, would step in and, from everything that we can see, apparently committed some form of coup taking charge of the government. And then when they were in charge, they reorganized the public sector and enforced mandates that would ensure that every Cardassian was taken care of, or at least a majority of them. A strong sense of national pride was instilled into Cardassians, and the public was told that they shouldn't have to suffer. Every Cardassian should be able to fulfill their life as they see fit, as long as they stayed true to the state, of course. This subject is honestly very interesting to me. For all of the crimes and sins that I am about to impart on the military and the system it created, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that they did do a lot of good. The military did bring back order, it brought back unity, it stopped crime, and people were being fed. There were a lot of families that didn't have to watch their children starve because of the Cardassian military. But I guess that's kind of the problem. Usually, when great evils are done, it's done in the name of good. The unintended consequence, at least we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt that it was unintended, of creating a quote-unquote prosperous environment is that a population will ultimately grow. As the population grows, so does the need for more resources, and as the need for more resources grows, so does the ambition of the military, as well as its power.
And there's more to life than duty to the state.
A Federation viewpoint, if ever I heard one.
And with this newly gained power, the military can then manipulate the populace to allow them to make more and more allowances, ensuring that they would be able to step ever closer to lines that should never be crossed. Unfortunately, as is the going theme with anything not Federation, information on the Cardassians is limited. What can be surmised, though, is that the military not only changed the policies of the original government, but also changed the culture of Cardassia. With a focus on family and dedication being a pre-existing trait of Cardassians, the family was the key component to changing how the culture would begin to view those who weren't Cardassians. Children would be encouraged and brought to see what their parents did for a living, from science to military, from a lab to a torture chamber. They would be shown and told that Cardassians were right and superior, and that they should treat others as animals. The literature would reinforce this with artists glorifying the state and showing that everyone is ultimately guilty. And with time, and a few generations, all of this would be embraced by the people and assumed to have been the way it always was. I would argue that when we look at Garrick, Ducat, and Damar, we see how the changes of the state impacts them and the generations of Cardassians. It highlighted the men they would become. The school systems were thought, by Cardassians at least, to be the best in the galaxy. And this was just further fueled by the military telling children all of this. They were told that Cardassians started out starving, and then this great regime came in and took care of them. The military crafted institutions that indoctrinate the populace, making them believe that the state is the only thing that can help them. So, with a population that went from destitution to now every Cardassian being able to eat, an authoritarian base crafting institutions that prop up Cardassia and Cardassians, and an area of space that has little to no resource to sustain this growing population, the only thing left to do is to expand and begin a policy of imperialism. This would impact the region and quadrant quite drastically, which included skirmishes with the Federation and other governments. However, those engagements are outside the scope of this video. For right now, we're only going to discuss the Bajoran occupation and oppression of the Bajoran people. The Bajoran occupation was the methodical strip mining of the Bajoran planet of all its resources via the use of Cardassian workers, paid laborers, and primarily Bajoran slaves. It's interesting to note that Cardassians did not initially attempt to oppress the Bajorans. The two governments, the Bajorans and the Cardassians, worked together fairly well and in tandem until the expansionist Cardassian government moved into their space and placed a military presence on Bajor. But even with that military presence, the occupation didn't immediately occur. That happened a few years later. The Bajoran occupation would not officially start until 2319 and lasted till around 2369. So, let's finally get into it. Let's discuss the Bajoran occupation. As mentioned, in 2319, Cardassia would establish the Bajoran Occupational Government, the ruling body that would control the Bajoran elements of the Bajoran people. Initially, the Bajorans were pacifistic towards the institution and offered very little resistance to Cardassia. However, the Cardassians would quickly move to expedite the strip mining process. This resulted in the Cardassian Central Command quickly instituting forced labor, slavery, and ultimately several forms of genocide. The entirety of the Bajorans' way of life was irrevocably changed. With the new puppet government installed, the caste system of the Bajorans was dismantled, and anyone found preaching the word of the prophets or practicing their religion was imprisoned. While all Bajorans could be put into slavery, the women of Bajor sometimes would become commodities, if they looked good enough. There would be comfort women who would provide all the needs for higher-ranking Cardassian officers. These women would often become concubines and were considered collaborators and race traders. Every Bajoran was considered to be lower, and thus Bajorans with even a tangential link to a crime could be considered a suspect. It wouldn't stop with them, however. Their friends and families would come under scrutiny as well. In order to ensure that the slave labor was efficiently utilized, there would be star bases as well as labor camps instituted, and the workforce would be divided. The most well-known starbase that was used as a slave labor camp was that of Terek Nor, where mining ore was the key objective. There were multiple camps, but the one talked about quite a bit was that of the Galatep labor camp. And don't worry, we're going to come back to this in a minute. The sons and daughters of Bajor didn't enjoy any official court system, nor have any protections under the law. They would be tried in tribunals ran by the Cardassian military. The punishments for being found guilty were extremely harsh, with a large majority of Bajorans being executed in plain view of their friends and family. The brutal and sadistic nature of the Cardassians against the Bajoran people would result in the Bajoran resistance. Freedom fighters rose up against the Cardassians in an attempt to force them to leave. Resistance fighters engaged in assassinations, smuggling, raids, bombings, and all kinds of other terroristic activities. These terrorist cells would treat Cardassians the same way that they had been treated. They didn't look at them as actual people. Cardassians were not worthy of life. This mentality would be so prevalent that even collaborators would be treated with the exact same disdain. Ultimately, the Cardassians withdrew from the Bajoran sector. Now, why they left or decided to leave the Bajoran sector is somewhat up for debate, but it's likely due to several factors. The Bajoran resistance was making the acquisition of resources from Bajor extremely costly, both in manpower and in wealth. The United Federation of Planets had begun to apply direct diplomatic pressure on the Cardassians, not to mention that colonies in the demilitarized zones and other territories were beginning to strain Cardassian military assets. So ultimately, they would withdraw, but the impacts of the occupation would be felt for many, many years after this event. The initial response, once the Cardassians had left, would be a type of Bajoran supremacy. Many believe that Bajor should be for Bajorans and Bajorans alone. A lot of them believe that non-Bajorans should be removed from vital areas, if not the entirety of the sector. These groups manifested in organizations like the Circle and others. There was a overwhelming hatred of all Cardassians, with many high-ranking officials believing that the only good Cardassian is a dead Cardassian. While relations between the Bajorans and Cardassians would resume at some point, a deep mistrust always existed within the generations that had to live through the occupation. And that really leads us to why this entire essay exists. The original question was, were there Cardassians that could be considered good while the occupation was occurring? But I think this is a fundamentally flawed question in quite a few ways. The question should have been, how does the enslavement of people change everyone and damage us all? Because the truth is, during the occupation, everyone was irrevocably damaged. During the occupation, monsters were given positions of extreme power and began to enact horrible treatments on Bajorans. This included, but wasn't limited to, Dr. Krell Moset, who began experimenting on Bajoran slaves to see how viruses would affect them, and ultimately would try to find cures. Well, mostly. Sometimes he just did it to watch them suffer. It would also include Gul Darhil, who would have slave laborers killed just to have them murdered, and whom worked people to literal deaths. The sad thing is that the Cardassian military failed to understand that this kind of destruction, this kind of, pure evil, impacts even Cardassians. This breaks individuals who were forced to follow the orders of Darhil as well as Krell, like that of Maritza. And another problem that the Cardassian Central Command failed to realize is that people who are so evil that will begin to experiment on anything they see as lesser, that means that ultimately they'll start to experiment on Cardassians. I stated at the top that family was important to Cardassian culture. That's true, but we do know that orphans and street rats on Cardassia are considered the dregs of society and often shunned. It wouldn't take much for men like Darhil or Krell to begin experimenting on Cardassians that weren't considered worthy. The effects on the Bajorans is just as stark, with a large segment of them hating everything Cardassian, wanting to murder people for just being Cardassian. A seething hatred of Cardassia. Even if said Cardassians opposed the occupation and fought against the government like those in the Cardassian dissident movement, were still worthy of destruction, at least according to the Bajorans. It would even cause a divide in third parties like the United Federation of Planets, where Starfleet officers and Federation citizens betrayed their uniforms and their loyalties to join the Maquis so that they could kill Cardassians. The Federation had long called it an internal matter and thus a violation of the Prime Directive. It appeared like Starfleet officers were sipping mojitos in paradise while Bajorans were being executed. At the beginning of this, I discussed institutionalized racism. The Cardassian government is the gold standard for this. Everyone in it, and everyone around it, was ineffably impacted. The victims of it included that within the Cardassian government and on Cardassia. It definitively included the Bajorans, who were the most victimized, but it also included third parties. In the end, Cardassian Central Command would likely claim that when Bajor was annexed, it was due to a need for resources. But that's a lie. Yes, they needed the resources, but they also intended to colonize the planet to continue the sustainment of a growing empire. This is what every fascist government does, but it's never enough. They will continue to take and take. The machine constantly has to be fed because its citizens constantly have to be pampered. It creates a system in which only the original race, or species, is dominant, even if it's hurting that species or race. And it means that nothing else is considered. The system impacts everything and everyone. It makes great people like that of Odo into collaborators. No one gets away scot-free. Wow, this was a pretty positive essay. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Let me know what you think about the Bajoran Occupation, the Cardassians, and the Bajorans. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.